get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Benner. I'm the faculty director of the Institute for Social Transformation, one of the co-sponsors of this event tonight, which is the second event of a whole series of 6 events on our U.S. Elections Forum series. And all 6 events are really designed to provide a platform for deep, thought-provoking conversations with leading scholars and practitioners about our quickly changing and polarized democracy. It's really a chance to also consider how we all can better participate in and help shape our democratic future. So I know you're going to love the conversation tonight, and I hope you'll tell your friends about the upcoming events as well. We'll have a little more information about that at the end. I want to thank especially for tonight all the students of Merrill College for joining us, and thanking all the co-sponsors that include Merrill College, the Humanities Institute, the Science and Justice Research Center, the Politics Department, Democratic Discourse and Engagement Initiative, Kresge College, John R. Lewis College, and College 9. And a special thanks again to Merrill College, the host and organizer for tonight's event. Before we jump in, I would like to share just a few details about the logistics of the event tonight. We're using a webinar tool, so there's no chat function, but we will have an opportunity to answer your questions during the second half of the program. We invite you to submit your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom at any time. Just click on that box and you can submit a question there, and we'll answer those towards the end. Tonight's event will be recorded and posted on the Institute for Social Transformation website. That's it for me. So to introduce the event tonight and our panelists, I'd like to introduce Kayson Tang. He's a Merrill College student, class of 2026, as well as vice chair of student government for Merrill College. Over to you, Kayson.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, welcome to Merrill College at UC Santa Cruz. As Chris said, I'm Kayson Tang, 3rd year at Merrill College, vice chair of Merrill Student Government, and peer navigator for our college core course. I will now briefly introduce our panelists for tonight. Allison Butler is a senior lecturer and director of the Media Literacy Certificate Program in the Department of Communication at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Dr. Nicholas L. Baham III is a professor of ethnic studies at California State University, East Bay, and teaches courses in Black Studies and Genders and Sexualities in Communities of Color. Steve Masick is professor of Communication and Media Studies at North Central College and a co-coordinator of Project Censored's Campus Affiliates Program. And Andy Lee Roth is the Associate Director of Project Censored, where he coordinates the project's validated independent news program. Now, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator for this evening, Dr. Nolan Higdon, who is an author and lecturer at Merrill College and at the Education Department at UC Santa Cruz. He's also a Project Censored national judge and founding member of the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas. Higdon's areas of concentration include critical AI literacy, podcasting, digital culture, news media history and propaganda, and critical media literacy. And all of Higdon's work is available at Substack. So now I'll turn things over to him. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Kayson, for that great introduction. I am Nolan Higdon, and it is a pleasure to be here today. I do want to start by thanking my provost, Ames McGinnis at Merrill College for making this happen, and all the great folks, especially those working behind the scenes from the Institute for Social Transformation. So Diana, Evan, Ned, Chris, and Lainey, thank you very much. I also want to thank all of you participants for showing up here, our interpreters we have here, and I want to send a special shout out to the students here at Merrill College, especially Kayson, who we all just met, my co-moderator. This is Kayson's second panel, and Kayson is quickly becoming the most famous person at Santa Cruz and is looking for an agent, just as agents are looking for Kayson. And to the Merrill students, you all did it again. You sent in so many thoughtful questions. You had me scrambling to decide which questions to ask our panelists tonight. They were great questions that demonstrated how much you've all thought about this. So thank you very much. This promises to be a great conversation where we're going to talk about identity. And identity plays a critical role in our society, shaping much of our media and politics. Identities are an expression of power and a critical factor to consider in our democracy. And during this election, news media are amplifying messages that deny Vice President Kamala Harris's blackness, or reduce immigrants to pet-eating criminals, or rely on ambiguous concepts of real America, or reduce and misrepresent gender, masculinity, elites, and populism. And in an election where voters could make history by sending a woman of color to the presidency, media messages about identity are especially important, a special important topic to understand, interrogate, evaluate, analyze, and critique. And that's why I feel so overjoyed to be joined by such a great, esteemed group of panelists to help us break through some of the media noise and better understand this stuff. So we're going to start with a lightning round here where I'm going to ask the participants some questions, a mix of questions we've received from students and whatever questions are posted by you all, the participants, using the Q&A feature. But to start out, I want to lay a little bit of groundwork for understanding who these panelists are and some of the work they do. So I'm going to turn to Allison Butler first. And Allison, I'll ask that you also, I know you're working on a project right now about patriarchy and censorship. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that project. And then because you do so much work looking at gender representations in news media, what are you seeing in terms of gender representation in the news media coverage of this election?
Sure. Thank you so much, Nolan, and thank you all very much for having me on this panel. I'm really thrilled to be a part of this great group. I am currently working on a project on how pop culture centers and silences women. So we have a lot of stories by and about women in pop culture, including in the news media, where women take a really central role. But simultaneous to that, even in a central role, they still manage to get kind of shut down and silenced. I will say that the work for this project took a pretty significant turn on July 21 at about 1:15 p.m. Eastern time. Quite frankly, I was having a nap after or during a bout of COVID. I woke up from my nap, kind of thought I might have still been in a little bit of a fever dream, wasn't quite sure what was going on, had to wake up really quickly and start thinking about this election in a totally different way. So to your question of how gender is treated in this election, I'd love to actually go back in time before we get to today, because what is happening today, what is happening to both Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, this isn't new, right? We're looking at a potentially precedent-setting presidency, quite frankly, potentially precedent-setting on either side. But it's not brand new. If we look back when Hillary Clinton was the wife of the governor, she was critiqued, she was front and center, and she was punished. When her husband, Bill Clinton, did poorly, it was usually blamed on her. And in fact, it was often blamed on things about her that had nothing to do with his policies. People did not like her hair. People did not like her headbands. People did not like the fact that for a fair portion of their marriage, she kept her maiden name. What that has to do with policy, I'm still trying to figure out, but that was absolutely part of it. Fast forward to 2016 when she's running for president, and we have the same argument over again. In fact, one of the leading op-ed writers in the New York Times, Maureen Dowd, wrote multiple essays about how Hillary Clinton, who had, by the way, used her married name at this point, changed her hair multiple times, wasn't feminine enough. She wasn't enough of a woman to be president, which might be fine if we actually had a measure of what was the correct amount to be feminine to be president. I am no fan of this next person, but I will defend her till the end of time. In February of 2023, when Don Lemon, then of CNN, referred to Nikki Haley as past her prime, and said that he was really, it wasn't him that was saying it. He was looking at the evidence and encouraged his co-panelists, who are kind of giving him a cringe look, to, look it up themselves. Nikki Haley, I don't agree with her policies. I'm opposed to pretty much everything she stands for as a politician. But to call a woman past her prime is to not focus on her intellectual competencies. It's to focus on her age, which is something that we've always done to women. And particularly past her prime is a euphemism for the assumption that she is postmenopausal and therefore, in the mid 20th century terminology, a castrate and no longer worthy of, being on the planet. So all of this and many more examples can bring us to our 2024 election, where we have Kamala Harris, whose name is ever so often mispronounced intentionally. And one of the things that I think we're seeing is that we, the American public, are invited to call her Kamala. It is certainly a way of making our politicians more approachable and more friendly. It kind of removes some of their standoffishness or their kind of wonkiness. But it is also a tactic particularly used on women who are ascending to or in power, to kind of bring them down, to kind of infantilize them to some extent. I think we as a nation might have all been surprised, and then this surprise was kind of reinforced in this Monday's interview on 60 Minutes, that Kamala Harris owns a gun. We don't necessarily expect that of our Democratic candidates, but we certainly expect it less of women. And that she owns a Glock, and that she says that she has shot it. So we're getting these sort of challenging ideas. Kamala Harris is actually probably playing up her gender the least of anybody. She talks about the value of her mother and of her sister and being raised by a single mother. She talks about being a stepmother. She talks about being an auntie, but very rarely is she specifically saying that she is going to be a groundbreaking president because of her gender. That is pretty much left up to everybody else. We also can't leave Tim Walz out of this, right? Tim Walz has a lot of big dad energy. He's got a lot of state fair energy. We know he's got some public speaking challenges, but one of the first nicknames that the Republican Party could come up for him was Tampon Tim, because he had signed a bill supporting menstrual products in bathrooms in schools. And the bill didn't specify for female students. The fact that the Republicans use a feminized insult against him isn't surprising. It's a way of attacking, I would say it's a side door way of attacking Kamala Harris by going through Tim Walz. So I'd say this is kind of the environment that we're looking at for, the next 27 days.
Okay, thank you. I want to get Nick in here as well, Dr. Nick Baham. Nick, I also would ask you the same. Tell us a little bit about the work you're doing on the People's Detective, which is really exciting project. I won't say too much, but I was able to be a guest on the podcast with it. It's great. So if you could tell folks a little bit about that work. And then I know in your classroom and scholarship and work you talk a lot about representations of race. And so I wonder if you can also tell us what you're seeing in terms of media messages about race in this election.
Well, thank you, Nolan. And it's fantastic to be here with this audience and looking forward to the questions that we get at the end. As for the work that I've done on the People's Detective is a detective novel. It's a departure from all the academic work that I've done. Probably in the first month, I probably have more readers of that work than I do of my academic work. One, because it's just more accessible. I wanted to do something that was accessible. It was cheaper. Regular people could get to it. This is a novel series. It's the first in a novel series that is centered in Oakland. Contemporary Oakland deals with Oakland problems. The first book deals with sex trafficking and missing and disappeared women of color in the streets of Oakland. Probably one of the most unreported stories in this region, and something that we covered, you and I, when we did our longstanding podcast, Along the Line. Subsequent books will deal with things like the crisis of the unhoused. I'm almost finished with that one. And also with the manufacturing of a crime wave in order to push back against progressive politicians and policing and DAs. As far as the racial question, this is really an intersectional question that Allison and I should really we should be having together, because you can't really separate one from the other. What I want to draw attention to is the way that the media is framing things, or I should say, the things that the media is missing with its current framing. So one of the first things that the media is missing is that in explaining Trump's racism and often sane-washing Trump, what we're forgetting is that the Trump phenomena in large part owes itself to the fact that Obama won the presidency twice with a minority of America's white vote. In 2008, Obama needed 43% of the white vote, and in 2012, he needed only 39%. And that's because if you're getting 93% of the black vote, over 70% of the Latino vote, 73% of the Asian American vote, which needs to be sort of disaggregated to be properly understood, but we never talk about this. Our media never talks about the Asian American vote. It's as though Asian Americans do not vote and are not a significant voting bloc. But that speaks volumes to the kind of fear that motivates Trump support. Obviously, a good portion of this is just brand loyalty to the Republican Party. But another part of the support, the going to the rallies, the buying everything he sells, from tennis shoes to, what is it now, watches, etc., has a lot to do with the fear that you don't need a majority of the European American vote in this country to win an election. The other thing that we're missing out on is, and by the way, going back to that point, I should say, if you look at mainstream legacy media, they're still talking about getting the white vote. Being out in Western Pennsylvania, let's get that, that vote. Okay, well, we've kind of moved on beyond that. The country has changed a little bit. The other thing we're missing out on is a deep understanding of what Harris as a mixed race person is all about. She's representative of an increasingly large number of Americans. There are 33 million Americans who identify as mixed race. And interestingly enough, Harris herself represents at least two significant ethnic groups that are both non-white. This is sort of different from the Obama phenomena. Obama was also mixed race. We didn't talk about him in that context. And the reason why we don't talk about people in this context, you've either got to be Black or South Asian, is because we do the one drop rule, right? So she is one or the other. And it's almost as though if we can't count her as one or the other, then maybe she's betraying one side or the other. It's really problematic. So we have not been able to have that as an in-depth discussion and to talk about intersectionalities of different racial identities. The other thing is that there isn't, I think, an in-depth discussion of the tepid support that Harris has amongst Black men and young Black voters. Obviously, some of that is just owing to straight up sexism. But the other things that we should be talking about are, for example, are Black people right now negotiating what it means to be Black in a world in which many of the successful immigrant groups in this country are also Black, but not from the United States? In other words, what does Black success mean vis-a-vis Nigerian success? There was that phenomena of the ADOS phenomena, African American descendants of slavery, excuse me, to distinguish Black people who are native born, go back several generations to slavery, from Nigerians, as though we're not part of the same diaspora, when in fact we have a very robust political militant tradition I'll just speak to the Black Panther Party, but we could go all the way back, Marcus Garvey and beyond, Edward Blyden, of people who identified with the entire diaspora. Additionally, are Black people regretting their allegiance to the Democratic Party? Not because they want to be Republicans, but because they're rethinking whether or not we should have been a part of our own Black political parties. And I went to a meeting last week. I can speak about this more of the uh, Justice and Peace Party with Dr. Cornel West and Dr. Melina Abdullah. Dr. Abdullah is a friend of mine, so I went. And this was a big topic of the conversation there. Are we also missing out, consequently, on an understanding of the radical Black tradition and its alliance with Palestinians? The fact that there was an Israeli Black Panther Party that supported Arab Muslims. The fact that Black folks have always been in solidarity with Muslims because roughly a third of us were Muslims, and Islam came to America through the Black experience. Are we missing out on discussions of a reemergence of class consciousness amongst Black communities, where we want to talk about something deeper than middle class tax cuts versus tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations? And then finally, are we missing out on understanding the radical importance and problematic spaces of having Black folks as DAs and AGs? There's two sides to that. All of us remember that there was a history where we didn't have representation there, and when our relatives were lynched, people went free. And then we did just the slightest thing, we were in jail for that. That hasn't stopped happening, by the way. But look, on the one hand, that it's a problematic issue. On the other hand, we have 3 Black prosecutors in this country who are the only people who are holding Donald Trump to account for his crimes against the Constitution. Think about that too. So is a complicated history here and a series of complicated discussions that media framing is not allowing us to have.
All right. Thank you very much, Nick, for that. And I'm going to turn over to Steve Masick now. And Steve, if I'm gonna both you and Andy are working with Project Censored, so I'm gonna split this question up a little bit. But I wondered if you could tell us just kind of a little bit, introduce people to what Project Censored is if they're not familiar with it, and then you do a lot of work looking at the corporate and political bias in news media. So tell us what you're seeing with your work at Project Censored regarding corporate and political bias.
Okay. First of all, thanks for having me on this panel. It's great to be with this distinguished group. And thank you all, the participants. I see there's 380 some on listening right now. So it's great to be talking to all of you. Project Censored is a national organization devoted to critical media literacy, but also to monitoring the news media and identifying important stories that are being underreported or censored altogether by the big corporate media. Every year, Project Censored releases a list of the top 25 most important underreported stories that are underreported by the corporate media. They release it as part of a book that we have been releasing it as part of a book called State of the Free Press, which is published by Censored Press and also Seven Stories Press. I can talk a little bit about some of the stories that have ended up on the list over the years. In addition to publishing a book, Project Censored has a website where we publish articles of media criticism about the way the media is performing, at any given time. We host our own webinars. Project Censored also has a radio show hosted by the director of the project, Mickey Huff, called the Project Censored Radio Show, which is available through KPFA and on stations near you. All of us spend a lot of time monitoring the corporate media to identify the sort of gaps and silences in corporate media coverage of important issues. And you asked, what am I seeing in terms of, bias and omissions in the corporate media coverage of this election? I think it's important to, first of all, to remember that the election is more than the presidential election. I know we are all fixated on that, because those are virtually the only races that the corporate media are covering. I can tell you, I'm in the Chicago area. The local Chicago news media is devoting several minutes every night to reporting on the presidential election. But we have elections for Senate, elections for state legislature, elections for Congress. We have elections going up and down the ballot happening here in Illinois. And if you're relying principally on broadcast media or legacy media, you're not getting any information at all about the important issues involved in those races. And I know from friends of mine around the country that the same is true around the country. This presidential election, which is momentous, I'm not suggesting that it's not, has sucked up right, all of the oxygen, out of the room, and that is the only thing that the corporate media is paying any attention to. I know this is a panel discussion about identity, and so far, Allison has talked a bit about gender and this coverage of this election. Nick has talked about race and this coverage of this election. I think it's incumbent on me to say something about the issue of social class, because our corporate media does a horrible job of reporting on the realities of social class, of the vast inequalities of wealth between the 1% and the rest of the world, and they do and the rest of the country, and they do an absolutely horrible job, systematically bad job of covering the labor movement and labor unions. So right now we are in the 4th week of the Boeing machinist strike, which is in the process of crippling one of the 2 major manufacturers, right, of airplanes in this country, and one of the 2 suppliers of airliners in this country. We have heard very, very little about this from the corporate media, and we've heard very little about it from the candidates. I will say that there was a little bit of a kind of rhetorical battle going on between Trump and Harris earlier in the summer about which candidate was going to be the champion of the working class. Remember that Donald Trump had Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters, address the Republican National Convention in July. That was sort of a really shocking scene. If anybody watched it, you could see that the delegates that were there had no idea how to react to the fact that there was this union leader standing and addressing a group of Republicans. He did that as a stunt because Donald Trump has a track record as being one of the most anti-labor, anti-union presidents in recent history. He was the one who appointed these 3 who were appointed, Supreme Court justices, who then passed the Janus decision, which made it much harder for public sector unions to organize. And he loaded up the NLRB with a bunch of, anti-union, union busting corporate lawyers, including Samuel Alito's son. Judge Alito, Supreme Court Justice Alito's son, who was an anti-union lawyer, and they proceeded to hand down a series of rulings that made it harder for workers to organize, made it easier for employers to decertify unions, and so on. None of that got much coverage at the time when Trump was president, and nobody is actually bringing that back up or reminding people about this in coverage of this campaign. So then I think Harris and Walz have been and especially the vice presidential candidate Tim Walz has been pretty vocal about the fact that he himself is a longtime union member. He was a member of the teachers union, and I think they have they have spoken about the importance of workers' rights, but we're not, we're not getting much coverage of it in the corporate media. And I'll end there because I'm over time.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm going to turn over to Andy in just a second, but I do want to remind folks, please do submit your questions. I'm keeping an eye on those and do intend to ask our panelists those questions as well. Andy, Lee Roth, you work with Project Censored as the associate director, and one of the programs that Steve started to describe there is the Validated Independent News program. I wonder if you can describe what that is. I think it'll help provide some important context about the work you do. And then I want to ask you to discuss how have establishment journalists' emphasis on officials as the subject and sources of news stories reinforce some of the biases that Steve was talking about. So can you tell our audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you, Nolan. And thank you, Kayson, for the introductions earlier. And thank you to our audience, both present there at the campus and online as well, for making this event what it is tonight. Yeah, so at Project Censored, students have always been centered since the project's founding in 1976. The project was founded in part by Carl Jensen, who taught at Sonoma State University, fielding a question from a student in a seminar that prompted him to think about how news coverage was affecting people's understanding of American society and politics in particular. And ever since then, students have been at the center of what the project does. Students contribute to almost every aspect of the project that Steve described a moment ago, including the yearbook, and most importantly, the production of the annual top 25 story list of important but underreported stories. And the Validated Independent News exercise is the kind of the assignment that drives all that. Since 2010, 2011, Project Censored, which, as I mentioned, was originally founded and based at Sonoma State University in California. In 2010, 2011, then project director Peter Phillips and current project director Mickey Huff expanded the project from Sonoma State by establishing what they call the Campus Affiliates Program, which is an informal, digitally networked collective effort to track and bring greater public attention to important but underreported stories. The networked people are faculty and students at colleges and universities across the United States, and depending on the year and participation, sometimes internationally. Students participating in a class where the professor is including Project Censored materials will select a story of interest to them, track the coverage of that news story or issue in the independent press, comparing and contrasting that coverage with any corporate news coverage it receives, and ultimately writing up a brief report that highlights the most important parts of the story and the competing corporate coverage, if there is any. And those get posted when they meet all the criteria. Those are posted on the Project Censored website as validated independent news stories. In turn, later in each academic year, we present to all the participating campuses, the participating faculty and students, and our panel of 28 international expert judges, the slate of stories, and everyone votes on those to determine the year's top 25 stories, which we promote through the yearbook. We receive coverage from news weeklies across the country, and also a variety of independent broadcast outlets. So it's really a collective effort to raise public awareness about important but underreported stories, that at the same time has the benefit of empowering students by developing their critical thinking and media literacy skills in service of tasks that take their work beyond the four walls of the classroom out to a wider public. So when we present and promote these stories, we give credit to the independent journalists and news outlets that broke the stories, and also to the student researcher and the faculty evaluator who identified and researched and vetted the story for the validated independent news coverage that we produce. Presuming that some of the several hundred folks tuning in tonight are themselves students and perhaps some teachers as well, we invite new participants in this program all the time. We welcome it. I will make sure that my contact information is available. If you are a student in a class that you think would be just right for this kind of work, please approach your professor and suggest they reach out, or you can reach out directly. And if you're a faculty, if you're an educator, a teacher, and you're interested in this, I am more than happy to talk in a different space about all the ways this assignment can be adapted to fit a variety of courses and disciplines and levels in students' progress through their college educations. So subjects and sources. In the context of representation and journalism and the election. Government and corporate officials are the subjects of most news stories, meaning they're the ones who are treated by journalists as the actors whose actions or inactions deserve attention and scrutiny. But those same government and corporate officials are also the sources of most news stories. Let's back up for a minute. When we talk about sources in journalism, we're talking about people, organizations, publications, and other forms of records or documents that provide some sort of newsworthy information or perspective. So if we're talking about human sources, that could include people like elected politicians and other government officials. Could be the leaders or spokespersons of some corporation or business, or eyewitnesses to some newsworthy event. Overwhelmingly, establishment journalists prefer officials as the sources of the news they report, often to the exclusion of many other types of people whose views might well be newsworthy and important to a complete understanding of some public issue. And the strength of this preference for official sources is part of what led sociologist Gay Tuckman to conclude that journalists have a bureaucratic view of the world. If you don't know Gay Tuckman's work, I really recommend her book, Making News, published in 1978. It's a pioneering study of how journalistic conventions shape our understanding of the world. And that sounds like a long time ago, but the book remains highly relevant today. The point being that when we're talking about identity and representation in the context of journalism, a person's official status may lead journalists to treat them as more important, more newsworthy than someone else who lacks official status. And that has deep consequences for the type of news stories we receive. I won't try to go and cite chapter and verse now, but during the Q&A, I'd be happy to offer some telling examples of this based on research that Project Censored colleagues of mine and I have conducted. For now, though, I think I'd like to make two more points on the links between representation, official sources, and newsworthiness. First, news coverage of elections might seem to be a significant exception to the rule that journalists prefer official sources. After all, doesn't election coverage regularly treat ordinary citizens in the role of voters as newsworthy? I think the answer is sort of yes and no. Ordinary citizens are featured in focus groups organized by news organizations. Sometimes journalists even quote individual citizens' views in their news reports or feature them in sound bites. But in those cases, there's a limited role for ordinary citizens and a limited relevance to their perspectives. They're treated in a kind of one-dimensional way as voters who matter only insofar as they'll support one or another candidates. And if you doubt that, think about the uproar in most of the establishment media over the so-called uncommitted voters earlier in the primary season. The most extreme version of this kind of reduction are, of course, opinion polls, a staple of election coverage, where the views of individual citizens matter only in aggregate. Okay, the second point to make about this is that all the aspects of identity that Allison and Nicholas and Steve have already talked about tonight, gender and sexuality, race and social class, work in conjunction with, right, together with establishment journalism's preference for official sources. So insofar as government and corporate organizations reflect systemic inequalities in the society at large, focusing journalism on representatives of those organizations will reproduce those very inequalities. And that's one reason why we at Project Censored are championing independent journalism, by expanding the corporate news media's narrow definitions of who and what count as newsworthy. Independent news outlets expose and push back against those systemic inequalities. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And before I turn it over to Kayson, we have some time here where I want to take some of the questions we've received from the audience and our students. And for those watching, we're going to do this sort of lightning round. If it's a question I think is directed at a person, I will say their name. Otherwise, we'll see if any or all the panelists want to answer a particular question. So I'll leave that up to you. Nick, I think this first one is directed at you. It says, are Americans aged 12 to 30 more mixed race than older Americans? And if so, what impact do you think that might have on this and future elections?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's evidence that it's a growing population in the country. And I think that this is deeper than just that it's factually a growing portion of the population. I think people are also much more willing to embrace their own self-understanding of themselves as mixed race persons. I would like a much more open and critical discussion in popular media about what this means. If we just take, for example, the person of Kamala Harris, and by the way, she has not been asked about this. She will not get asked about this. She could serve, I'm going to predict she could serve 2 terms, and no one will ask her about this. But this is someone who linguistically, religiously, culturally, has deep experiences in both South Asian and Black communities. For those who say she's not Black enough, she went to Howard University. I don't know how much time she spent in Oakland, California, but that's enough. Okay? If you've ever attended an HBCU, that's enough to understand something fundamental about Black culture. Interestingly enough, and Allison pointed this out around gender, she doesn't actually draw her attention to herself as a Black woman specifically. She's not. But also, in terms of her South Asian identity, this is someone who has been to India. This is someone who's familiar with Hinduism, who I think that she has some linguistic skills, is very close to her mother, was primarily raised by her mother. What does that mean in terms of a lived experience that provides a perspective in solving issues? We tend to think about the value of diversity, whether it's in government or in the corporate space, as providing something other than the normal solutions. So if I'm asking somebody, everyone a question, and everyone's had the same experiences, the feeling is we're going to come up with relatively the same sorts of answers, right? What kind of answers does someone like this, who has a radically different experience than the people that we've tended to elect, particularly Donald Trump, by the way, who is a sort of a relic of an earlier age, as he approaches 80. What new solutions get put on the table? How does that, we need to have a substantive discussion about how does that wind up, where does that wind up in policy? Whether we're talking about the legalization of marijuana, which is something that she's come around to after not being for the legalization of marijuana early in her career, to a peace process to end the war in Gaza. That's where it's significant for me. But if we can't have any sort of a substantive discussion around this, and I think that that's what young people who increasingly identify as more and more diverse bring to the table. One of the things that I know as a professor at a university campus that has diversity at multiple levels, intersectional identities at multiple levels that you cannot identify when you walk into the classroom. is that the perspectives are going to be wildly varied and inventive, highly original coming out of those. I want that. I want to value that. And that also, by the way, gets to the heart of why immigration is valuable in this country and has always been valuable in this country. So if we can't have that discussion about what she can bring to the table as a person of mixed race identity culturally, what that cultural experience is, can we ever get to substantive discussions about the real value of immigration? What are Haitian immigrants, for example, actually bringing to Springfield right now that Springfield needed and didn't have?
Good. We also received quite a bit of questions about age as an identity, and some folks asked if anyone in here could talk a little bit about how the media has handled the discussions of age in terms of Biden, Trump, and Harris. Anybody on the panel want to speak to how the media has talked about age in this election?
I can just give my impression, which is that it was an issue they were obsessing about, that it was being discussed on national television talk shows and on radio, and was being covered as a story when President Biden was in the race. Since he has dropped out, it has disappeared as an issue, even though Donald Trump is 78 years old and is, showing some signs, right, of that aging. So it is no longer, though, being treated, I think, as an issue.
And I think when they're talking about Harris, they talk about her age euphemistically, right? I mean, I agree with Steve. As soon as Biden dropped out of the race, age was no longer a conversation. And it, in a way, at least for the Democrats, it couldn't be. But what we get from Harris is her energy, her excitement, her laughter. Her laughter is suddenly good, right? I mean, here's another gendered thing. Like, prior to her running for president, her laughter was annoying. She laughed too much. It was sort of negative. As soon as she became the candidate, her laughter was amazing, right? It was a sign of her vivaciousness. So I think we're, in a way, still talking about age. We're just talking about it very differently. We're using a lot of sort of different and careful language, and we're praising age, right? We do hear every once in a while that she is 59 years old, but it's sort of a very neutral 59, right? There isn't any gasp associated with it. There isn't any exclamation point associated with it. It is neither positive nor negative, but it's kind of stealth put in there as this sort of new energy in the Democratic Party.
There's the t-shirts that people wear that say "old guys rule." And it's supposed to be like, oh, it's cool to be like an old guy who surfs or rides a mountain bike or whatever. But in some ways, like, that catchphrase works for a lot of American politics. Since Allison already mentioned Nikki Haley, I feel empowered to quote Nikki Haley, who back in January of this year said most Americans don't want a rematch between Biden and Trump. And Haley boldly predicted, this is one of the few times I would say I'm in agreement with her, the first party to retire its 80-year-old candidate is going to be the one who wins. I hope I'm not inclined to agree with Haley on many political perspectives, but I hope she's right about that prediction.
We also got someone joining us who asked a few questions about the conservative identity, asking, are there any conservative news outlets of value, and this is the same person, or is there any forum where intelligent debates from left versus right happen that you could recommend?
I mean, I will just mention a conservative outlet that I sometimes look at that is sometimes surprisingly good. That's Compact Magazine. It is not standard. It's not a standard conservative outlet, but it's one place where you will hear conservative critiques, for example, of the outrageous defense spending that the U.S. Is engaged in. Right now, the Pentagon's budget is more than $850 billion a year, more than $850 billion a year. And you will read critiques from a conservative point of view about the kind of wastefulness, graft, and corruption that drives such a bloated defense budget. I appreciate that. Some of the other things that some of the other perspectives that they articulate I do not agree with, but I think they're often very, very well informed, very intelligent. In terms of places where you can find, debates between the left and the right, it's actually a complaint that I often have, is that the left and right don't often debate. Here in Chicago, a friend of mine who is the director of a political reform group stages debates between the Federalist Society, which is the really reactionary lawyers association, and the American Constitutional Society, which is the progressive legal association, about important legal issues. I think that there is a need for more such debates where you bring together ideological opposites to have a debate. I don't see, it does happen to some degree in academia, but it's not happening, I think, in the popular press.
Okay. And there was a closely related question that came in earlier too, which is there's an individual who said that they identify as a male and that they're online a lot and conservative media target them with content. And they were wondering whether or not it's a good idea to engage with that content. And they asked the panel, how do we best challenge conservative media creators' efforts to position themselves as the voice of male identity, in essence, weaponizing and taking ownership of maleness?
I would be really cautious about engaging any online commentary. I think any oxygen for it. I mean, I'm all for debate, but I guess I'd rather be involved with a debate with somebody that I know is human. Coming at this from a slightly different perspective, some of the work that I've been doing on the ways in which pop culture center and silence women is looking at online critiques, looking at online commentary, social media commentary, looking at campaigns that have been designed specifically to discredit women, which then do transfer to, IRL, to real life, where women are doxxed and subsequently attacked, where women have had to have security teams be with them for years because of the attacks threatened upon them and sort of in their presence. When we look at somebody like Christine Blasey Ford, who came out against Brett Kavanaugh with very credible sexual assault charges in 2018, it's now 2024, and she still has a security team. I think it can be dangerous, right? I mean, I would, as a human being, I would like to believe that we can be involved in healthy argument, in healthy debate, in productive tension, right? I think if we all did agree with our social media encourages us to live in beautiful echo chambers where we never have to hear anything that we disagree with. And that's a lovely place to be, but it's not real, right? It's not what's actually happening out in the world. And so as a human, I would love to be able to be involved in debate, but I do worry that if we stay focused strictly online, we're dealing with folks who can hide in anonymity, and we're dealing with bots who aren't human beings, who are, very carefully programmed to fuel the fire, to inflame, to make incendiary, because it gets more clicks, it gets more attention, it gets more eyeballs to advertisers. Believe me, I hate seeing some of that stuff, and I have to truly, literally sit on my hands instead of react to it. But I guess I would ask the question of what is it to whom am I trying to converse? And is that even a real human being on the other side?
Okay, great. And we also received a question. I think it was Dr. Bayham had touched upon this earlier, but a student wrote in and asked about how it's possible that we have such a, lack of Palestinian voices in our news media, especially while they're covering the events in Gaza so much. Is there a reasonable justification for this lack of representation?
Yeah, I can take that a little bit, but perhaps other people want to add to this. There is a reason why the voices are not welcome. I mean, this is even before Gaza. This is the world's largest prison camp. These are fully colonized people who have been through and are going through right now some of the most brutal experiences that anyone faces on this planet. And you don't want to hear from them. KQED or public radio will broadcast those voices. Democracy Now!, other outlets will voice them. I was listening to something on public radio where they were interviewing people in Gaza, and mainstream media can't handle it when someone says, and I will quote, "Every day I wake up and pray to die." Mainstream media can't handle that because they do not have the critical tools to understand and to convey to you, the listener, what the depth of that kind of suffering is. And that's why they have other people speak for folks and kind of wash it a little bit. You know, there's a little washing of the genocide. And I would say, by the way, that this is not something that is, let me be fair, this is something that happens in war. I did see a mainstream broadcast. I cannot remember what broadcast I was looking at, but someone was interviewing a relative of someone who had been taken hostage by Hamas. And the things that she was describing about the unspeakable ongoing horror of dealing with the absence of that person from her life. There aren't words for that. It doesn't translate well to camera. And again, if you don't have people around you who can provide the analytical tools to help you understand that, they want to avoid that at all costs.
Thank you. And it's a nice segue since Senator Mitt Romney talked to us about how TikTok was banned for giving narratives about Gaza that were alternative to our legacy media. We got a lot of questions about TikTok. Some folks, one question brought up how their understanding is there's a lot of folks who are eligible to vote but don't vote. And for those folks who are getting their news from TikTok, how do we reach non-news voters or non-news, non-participating voters? So we had that question. And then we also had a similar question, which is, do you all believe these platforms give individuals of marginalized communities a real platform to be heard? So if you want to answer both or part of those questions.
Can I jump on that?
Sure.
Yeah. So one answer to the TikTok question is, I think it's important for people who that's where they're getting news, it's important to go there. And a team of Project Censored people are creating short videos for TikTok. One of them is a series called Critical Media Literacy in Action. Nolan has been a featured guest on one of those episodes, a featured expert on one of those. So I think it's important to reach out and not cede that ground to, what we at Project Censored call junk food news. They're, clickbait celebrity type headlines. It's possible to do solid content. You can't do in-depth content on TikTok, but you can do things that are pointers for people who might be interested in learning more. I think on that question of reaching people who are disinclined to vote and not paying attention to news, I think all of us who have taught have had some experience in our classes with students who, if they're candid, will say, I don't pay attention to the news. And that would certainly happen when I taught courses in sociology at a variety of institutions. And I would often ask, if I felt like I knew the student well enough, well, why is that? Why aren't you paying attention to news? And often the answer is because it's too depressing. And so another kind of missing angle, I think, in terms of connections between politics and journalism is a lack of visibility for solutions journalism, where we're talking about not the kind of feel-good stories that come at the end of the evening news segment where the cat was stuck in the tree and the firefighters came with the hook and ladder and rescued it, but rather serious stories of communities coming together and organizing to address systemic problems that they face. And for many people who are discouraged by news, and this goes beyond kind of election coverage to the broader role of news in our lives, solutions journalism represents a vital alternative to most of what's on offer in the corporate media. And I think that's a way perhaps of engaging people who have intentionally checked out of the news, almost out of like a self-protective attitude of, I can't take the constant flow of negative and depressing content that I otherwise am confronted with. So even like Nick talks some about the situation in Gaza and Palestine, where there's not a lot of good news and solutions are desperately needed. But there is reporting that will convey a sense that what's happening there is not tragic, it's not inevitable, it doesn't have to be that way. And there are people who are working desperately with their lives at stake to try to make it otherwise. And those stories are often omitted in the kind of typical coverage that we get that presents war in general and violence in Gaza and now expanding into Lebanon and other places as kind of chaos and disorderly. And I think that that does a disservice to all. It makes it less likely that we will find meaningful solutions, and it does a disservice to the people who are on the front lines. It's important, I think, in that context, just going back to Gaza and the plight of Palestinians in terms of their treatment by the U.S. Media, to note that for decades, the U.S. corporate media have treated Gaza's inhabitants as non-persons and daily life in Gaza as non-news, and that as a result of that, these omissions often function as tacit permission for abuses of power. And so corporate media didn't create, the U.S. corporate media didn't create the violent, inhumane conditions in Gaza, but their shameful legacy of narrow and frankly pro-Israel coverage indirectly laid the groundwork for the ongoing atrocious human suffering taking place there now.
Okay, thank you. We have another question came in as well, and I'm going to read the beginning of this question. They prefaced it, I think, in a powerful way. They said many women on this talk with MDs and PhDs are so used to being in a room and not being called on to make a comment. Yet if a male makes the same or similar comment, it is acknowledged and perhaps praised. And they use that context to ask, can we also talk about how Harris is overly scrutinized while Trump's outrageous comments and often errors are not fully addressed? And it should also be mentioned about the conference last week in New York City with psychiatrist Brandy Lee and other mental health professionals, military people, et cetera, regarding the clear, serious mental health concerns about Trump and his inability to oversee our democracy. So does anyone want to talk about that double standard?
Sure, I'll give that. Yes, I think I've been in many of those meetings. I think the person asking the question and I must have been in some very similar meetings. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that Harris is facing as a candidate is she is on an extremely difficult tightrope. Again, I don't want it to necessarily, like, her policies or her potential policies, it's not so much how one feels about that. It's that however she answers a question, it is either she can't do this being president because she's a woman, or she's just answering that way because she's a woman. She's interested in this topic only because she's a woman, or she's not interested in it because she's a woman. I mean, it's a terrible double standard that we don't really provide, we don't put our male politicians through. We live in this world where our female politicians, as well as just female people in general, are not allowed to be complicated. They are one-dimensional characters, right? You are either good or bad. You are either a stay-at-home mom or you are a person who works outside of the home. I suppose in this case, we're talking about childless cat ladies. We don't allow our women, we do not invite our women to be complicated, to be multidimensional, and we assign so much to their gender. I think a counter narrative to this is, when Bill Clinton was in the office of the presidency and was notorious for his extramarital affairs, many of which may have been consensual, many of which may have not been consensual. He is also the president who signed into law the Violence Against Women Act, which codified treatment specifically for domestic violence and for violent acts perpetrated against women because they were women. He is allowed to be a complex and complicated and deeply flawed individual that still was sort of multidimensional. When we're looking at somebody like Hillary Clinton or Nikki Haley, or in our most present current events, Kamala Harris, we're looking at bodies that are only allowed to be one-dimensional. And we don't brush aside, or we're not invited to brush aside any kind of speaking flaw that she might have, any slip up or trip up, any way that she doesn't do it perfectly, she therefore does it terribly. And so many of us who have been in those, like, we know exactly what this feels like.
Can I just quickly jump in on the second part of that question, which is that I have believed since about 2017 or 2018, a couple of years into Trump's presidency, that the media was guilty of normalizing his behavior. I mean, we have to, and normalizing his legacy. I mean, you have to keep in mind, this is somebody who is twice impeached, has been found guilty. His company's been found guilty of financial fraud. He has been found guilty, by a jury of being responsible for sexual assault. He's been accused of dozens of women of sexual assault, credibly. He's still facing charges related to tampering with elections in Georgia and countless, inappropriately handling confidential documents and countless other charges. If this had been Bill Clinton, for example, let's take somebody who also went through an impeachment. There would be no surviving it because he would have been savaged in the media for these things. So he has been sort of normalized, and I have struggled with why that is. But I believe that especially television loves Trump. Remember, he was propelled into his political career because he was a reality show host, right? He hosted The Apprentice. They love the controversy that he generates because it generates ratings. And so they're not going to be too hard on him, even though it could be a horrible thing for democracy. And in fact, CBS President Les Moonves said exactly that when Trump first ran for president in 2016. He's horrible for democracy, but he's great for ratings. And I think there's something that dynamic, that logic is still at play here in the big corporate media's treatment of Trump. I'll just leave it at that.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to bring back in my partner in crime, my right-hand person, my co-moderator who's here to show me how it's done. Kayson Tang, I'm going to hand it over to you, all right?
Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to Nolan, and to the audience as well for participating so actively in this webinar. Now, I have a few questions from Merrill College students that I will direct to the panel, and then afterwards I'll turn things back to Chris. So, I mean, what can I say? Merrill students, they submitted hundreds of very thoughtful questions, and I'm very happy to see the turnout of responses we received. So I just want to thank all of you for taking the time to do that. And we want to be respectful of your time, so we can only cover a few for tonight. So let me start right away. My first question I will give to Nick. A Merrill student asks, what responsibility does the media have to accurately portray identity during election coverage, particularly in avoiding the reinforcement of stereotypes and biases?
Well, it has the same responsibilities it has to the truth, generally speaking. There are, the media, I think, is so far away from understanding the general media, from understanding what the lived realities are of any particular racial or frankly, as Allison points out, any gendered experience, that it's not even funny. And so there are a lot of things that we tacitly accept. Um, as was discussed, just recently, this issue about Harris and her status as a woman versus this low testosterone 80-year-old man who comes across as Mr. Uber. I don't know. There's a whole cult of this stuff, by the way, and that I think a lot of the media are complicit in is sort of these low T men who are revisiting their white men in particular who are revisiting their masculinity in some way and are complicit in putting down women in this culture and the possibility of women's leadership. I know this is a little bit of a tangent from the question, but for God's sakes, the rest of the world has had a woman president. What is our problem? The rest of the world understands women as being as strong as anybody else and wise, etc. What is wrong with the United States of America? Our neighbors to the southern border have gone ahead and done it. What's wrong with us? Um, so the media has a tremendous responsibility to get it right. But again, these are not simple discussions. And that's what I've been trying to draw attention to today. They have to be properly framed and dealt with the proper amount of seriousness and at depth. These are not discussions that you can have in the space of 2 or 3 minutes where you've got 5 people who disagree with one another on a panel who are going to shout one-liners at one another. You can't have those kinds of discussions about race. And so or gender or class. So some of the best spaces to have those, and I think where they are best had, are in public radio, and in particular around local public radio, where people can sit with the topic. And they'll bring on 1 or 2 experts at most to just kind of go through these at a much deeper level. So if you're looking for that kind of a discussion at that level, that's where I would encourage you to first start looking.
Thank you, Nick, for sharing your thoughts with us tonight. I'll go ahead and move on. My next question will be for Allison. As Merrill student asks, gendered language is often used in media coverage of female candidates. How do you think the media's representation of women running for office in 2024 compares to previous election cycles, and what impact might this have on their political legitimacy and voter trust?
Oh, wow. Well, and I mean, I would say though, I mean, to Nick's point, like we got to catch up, right? The United States is credited for being leaders in so many different things: education, medical breakthroughs, science, et cetera, et cetera. Not in gender, right? Absolutely not in gender. Like it's high time for us to catch up. And like there's a flag in my neighborhood. I pass it by when I'm walking my dog, and it says something to the effect of like, after 248 years, let's give the girls a chance. I'm not a huge fan of like the girls in the sense that I don't want to continue infantilizing it, but I think to answer the student's really, really excellent question is just that, right? I love this flag. I love walking my dog by this house. And it also drives me nuts because we're talking about grown adult women and calling them girls. And I know that that can get used as a term of affection, but I think what it draws to the larger issue is that the US media treats gender, it oversimplifies it. It tries to create it as a binary, and it tries to create it as a binary, both like vertically and horizontally, right? That we have 2 genders, so there's sort of maybe a horizontal, and that we have kind of 2 ages, right? You're either a girl or you're a woman. And let me bring in my Brittany here. There's a lot of us who aren't a girl and not yet a woman. She introduced us to a much more complex understanding of gender, and we kind of mocked her for it, right? But I think maybe Britney Spears was kind of onto something. I think part of your job as students, part of our job as educators, is to point out when we see these gender disparities. What happens when we refer to adult women as girls? What happens when we call adult women with relative power or no power at all whatsoever by their first names? We have to kind of start pushing back on that, right? We are supporting this limited narrative when we continue to go down that road. So our job is to kind of push against it, to push back on it, to try and then also notice when gender is going to be talked about in a much more complex way. Let's acknowledge that. Let's pay attention to that. And let's recognize that isn't actually all that difficult, right? I'm involved in some work on my campus where we're updating and revising some otherwise pretty dull administrative policies. One of the easiest things to do is just remove gender from it. We're talking about offices, we're talking about humans, we're talking about places. We don't actually need to assign gender to it because gender is not part of that conversation. And so let's try and point it out or move it in ways that make it much more complex than I think our mainstream media allow it to be. It is our mainstream media's job to simplify stories, right? To make them thin, to make them superficial. Our job is to push back on that.
Thank you so much, Allison, for your insight on that. And we'll keep moving. I have this question for Steve from a Merrill student. How does political propaganda contribute to the division between working class white communities and working class BIPOC communities?
That's a great question. And I think certainly the political propaganda that's coming from the Trump Vance campaign, but also from a number of dark money front organizations that are being funded by right-wing foundations, and right-wing billionaires are doing a lot to sort of foment division between in the working class, between, as you say, members of the white working class and the BIPOC community or the immigrant working class, which is a significant portion of the working class in the United States. And also between male members of the working class and women. And women are actually the majority of the working class. According to some sociological measures, women hold more working class jobs in the United States than men currently. And they're doing it very deliberately by, for example, playing on this this old card that for example, immigrants are taking American jobs or native-born people's jobs. This is preposterous. It has always been a lie. It was a lie back when it was used to drive the Chinese Exclusion Act, like in the early part of the 20th century in California, and it's still a lie today. And yet, these right-wing political candidates, and especially the Trump and Vance campaign, are paying it lip service, and then it's being echoed and replicated and recycled, those claims, by Fox News, by Newsmax, by a network of right-wing websites. And I think the best way to counter it is just to counter it with facts, right? Because in fact, the working class has more interest in common than they do, right? Than they have reasons to disagree with each other. Everybody who's a member of the working class has an interest in having affordable health care, having higher wages, having more job security, more rights at work, more protection on the job. A better family and medical leave, and more affordable childcare. Those are all things that all members of the working class, regardless of their immigration status, their race, their ethnicity, their gender, they all have a vested interest in, and that tends to get lost because of the propaganda.
Thank you so much, Steve, for taking the time to share your perspective with us. And my last question is for Andy. So this Merrill student asks, I understand you have done research on algorithmic bias, particularly concerning transgender issues. Could you discuss how the media has covered the increase in anti-trans bills proposed across the US in recent years? This year alone, 45 bills have been passed and 658 have been considered.
There has been a heartening increase in coverage of those transphobic pieces of legislation, but it's not enough. And part of my work done in collaboration with a colleague of mine, Avram Anderson at Cal State University Northridge, has been to look at how kind of algorithmic content filtering and gatekeeping of content online goes hand in glove with this legislation. And so one example, there's attempts in Texas, for instance, to say that anyone who provides health information to a young person who's around trans identity could be held liable for child sexual violations of child sexual content laws. When you take that onto from the real world or offline into the online world, how that ties into current understandings of, say, how Section 230 works, and other kind of in-house things that are done at big platforms, the big social media platforms that are controlled by, say, Meta and others. It's really, really dangerous. Like, I think what we're talking about here, although there are some glimmers of hope in terms of how this is being covered in the news, but overall, if we're talking about media generally, there's a serious clampdown on vital information at the same time as social media platforms are, whether intentionally or inadvertently, are becoming places where transphobic and homophobic content is promoted. And so that's a really valuable question that I don't feel like I can do justice to in the time we have. But I think it's a question that, echoing what Allison said a moment ago, like, we should be asking these questions, we should be conducting research into these questions, and basically trying to raise public awareness around this kind of throttle point where valuable, necessary health information is being restricted at the same time as transphobic and homophobic content is being promoted on many social media platforms. And I am not advocating for censorship, but I think this is one of those areas where we need critical media literacy in order to bolster the signal of messages that need to be out there as lifelines, literally lifelines to people, and to try to combat and confront the hateful messaging that's not grounded in any kind of scientific evidence that we have. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy, for your valuable input. And I just want to thank you to all the panelists, and I want to thank you again to my amazing co-moderator, Dr. Nolan Higdon. Now I'll turn things back over to Nolan, who will continue with the rest of our webinar for tonight. Thank you. All
right. Yeah, I want to thank all of our panelists and wherever you are out there. Give them a virtual round of applause. Special shout out to Allison and Steve. Steve is in Central Time Zone. Allison's on the East Coast, so they stayed up late to do this for all of you. So much appreciated there. And I'm going to hand it over to Chris Brenner.
Well, Nolan, you took the words out of my mouth. I was going to thank all the panelists, but especially Allison and Steve for staying up so late to join us in this conversation. And I just thought I'd offer a few reflections. One is just, wow, what a great conversation, and so thankful and grateful for all of your input. Steve, one of the things you said about the comment from, I guess it was the president of CBS, about Trump being bad for democracy, but great for ratings. And part of what I've appreciated in this conversation, as well as the discussion we had last week on the landscape, media landscape, is, in many ways that might be equally said about our mainstream media landscape. It does not deal with the depth and complexity of the issues that you all are talking about, because it sells to talk about the horse race and the simplistic issues and moving things ahead. And I think that points to the importance of discussions like this. Nick, I was also particularly struck by your comments, and it was so heartfelt, about what is wrong with us as a country that here in 2024 that we have not had a woman president. And I was reminded, it was Shirley Chisholm, the real path breaker 52 years ago, was the first woman to run on one of the two major party platforms for president in this country, an African-American woman who struggled as much against gender discrimination as some of the racial discrimination in this country.
Right. And a woman with a pro-Palestinian part of her platform too.
Yeah, a real path breaker in so many different ways. And here it is 52 years later, and we're still trying to learn from that experience. But I think it points to what I think you all represented, which is the complexity of these issues of identity, the intersectionality and multiple dimensions of identity in American politics, and how poorly so much of our media is positioned to have discussions and help us think about the role of identity in American society. So deeply appreciative for all of your input. One of the things I'll also point to, you all touched on one of the comments about TikTok and social media and sort of the misinformation and disinformation in that sector. For the audience, I think that points to our future events. This is the second event in series of 6, and on October 22nd at 7 p.m. we actually have a session, an event focused specifically on engaging digital democracy and looking at tools to recognize political information. But if you've enjoyed this conversation, you don't have to wait very long for the next one, which is tomorrow night, when we actually have an all-star cast of professors from our own UC Santa Cruz politics department, talking about the US elections and democracy in these deeply polarized times, and a whole range of different issues connected to that. And then next Tuesday, we have an alumni from UC Santa Cruz, Carmen Rojas, who's now CEO of the Marguerite Casey Foundation, who's done tremendous work really looking at community development, community power building, and the role of philanthropy in trying to shift some of these power relationships in our society. And then finally, the Decoding the Headlines, Misinformation in the 2024 Presidential Campaign on October 30th. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and a final thank you to all of our panelists. And go out, vote, become civically engaged, and let's help to make our democracy even better.